There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes not from standing at the edge of something high, but from standing at the edge of your own thinking. You have felt it, perhaps without knowing what to call it. It arrives quietly, usually after some moment of genuine clarity, some instant in which you saw through a belief you had held for years, or recognized a pattern in yourself that you had never before noticed. And instead of relief, instead of the liberation that clarity is supposed to bring, what you felt was something more unsettling, a loosening, as if the ground beneath your understanding had shifted slightly, and you realized with a kind of cold certainty that it could shift again, that it would shift again, that nothing you believed with such confidence this morning was necessarily safe from the same dissolution that had taken everything before it. Most people, when they describe the desire for freedom, describe it in terms of release. They imagine freedom as the removal of an obstacle, the opening of a door, the end of a constraint. They imagine that to be free is to finally be able to move, to speak, to become what they have been prevented from being. And there is truth in this, certainly. The person locked in a prison cell is not free, and their liberation is a real and meaningful thing. But this is the outer surface of freedom, the political layer, the one we have mapped most carefully because it is the one most visible to others, the one that leaves evidence in laws and barricades and declarations. What we have mapped far less carefully, what we have in many ways actively avoided examining, is what happens inside a mind when it genuinely begins to move without constraint. What freedom does not just to the body or the political subject, but to the thinking self. Because when you examine this carefully, as Hannah Arendt spent much of her life examining it, you find something that does not match the image we carry of liberation. You find something far more demanding, far more vertiginous, and in a very specific sense, far more dangerous than almost any external authority. Arendt wrote that thinking itself is the most subversive act available to a human being. Not because thinking leads necessarily to revolution, or to protest, or to the dismantling of institutions, though it sometimes does, but because genuine thinking that does not stop when it becomes uncomfortable, thinking that follows its own logic wherever that logic leads, dismantles the most fundamental thing of all, the settled self. The self that knows what it believes. The self that has answers ready. The self that can function smoothly in the world because it does not have to reconsider everything from the ground up, every single morning. If this resonates with something you have been circling for a while, if you have noticed that genuine understanding tends to cost you something rather than simply reward you, consider subscribing. I explore these territories every week, and I would be glad to have you along. We have an image of the tyrant in our culture that is quite vivid. We know what tyranny looks like from the outside: the suppression of dissent, the enforcement of a single narrative, the punishment of those who deviate from the approved understanding. And we have generally understood tyranny as something that happens to people, something inflicted upon a population by a force external to them. This is accurate as far as it goes. But Arendt's analysis, particularly in her work on totalitarianism and later in her writings on thinking and judgment, reveals something that we find much harder to look at directly. The structure of tyranny, its essential mechanism, is not primarily about force. It is about the elimination of thinking. A tyrant does not merely want obedience, a tyrant wants thoughtlessness. The truly controlled person is not the one who is physically prevented from acting, but the one who has ceased to question whether the actions available to them are worth taking, the one who has ceased to notice that there were ever other possibilities. The most efficient tyranny is one that does not need to be enforced from outside, because it has been internalized so thoroughly that the person who lives within it can no longer tell the difference between their own desires and the desires that have been shaped for them. Now here is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because if the tyrant's greatest achievement is the elimination of independent thought, then the most dangerous possible thing from the tyrant's perspective is not an army or a revolution. It is a single person who has learned to think freely. And thinking freely does not mean thinking whatever you wish. It does not mean thinking pleasant thoughts or confident thoughts or thoughts that confirm what you already believe you know. Thinking freely, in the sense Arendt meant it and in the sense that matters most, means following your own reasoning without stopping when it arrives somewhere inconvenient. It means being willing to remain in what she called the two-in-one. The inner dialogue that does not resolve into a settled position but continues, turns back on itself, considers the counter-argument, lives with uncertainty rather than pretending certainty has been achieved. And this is dangerous not to others, not primarily but to the self that undertakes it. I want to stop here for a moment because I suspect that many of you watching this have been living with this particular kind of danger for a long time without anyone ever naming it. You have felt the destabilizing quality of your own mind. You have had thoughts that made your previous certainties feel suddenly hollow. You have looked at beliefs you once held with complete confidence and found them not wrong exactly, but insufficient, thinner than they appeared, unable to bear the weight of everything you now understand. And rather than this being celebrated, rather than being recognized as a sign of genuine intellectual development, you have found that it makes you harder to be around, harder to place, harder to comfort, and sometimes genuinely frightening to yourself. How long have you been living with this unsettledness? When did you first notice that thinking deeply seemed to cost more than it returned in obvious rewards? I want you to share in the comments below, not because I am asking for engagement, but because I know that someone else watching this needs to see that they are not alone in this particular experience. If words are hard right now, if it simply feels too complex to articulate, just type, "Thinking is costly," because it is. And naming that truth out loud, even briefly, creates permission for others to name it too. Your willingness to be honest about this matters beyond just yourself. The philosopher who thinks genuinely, and by philosopher, I do not mean someone with a degree or a title, but simply someone who has made the commitment to follow their own questioning wherever it leads, does not arrive at a place of peace and settled certainty. This is the great misunderstanding, the false advertisement of a certain kind of philosophy, particularly the versions sold as self-improvement or as a path to inner calm. Genuine philosophical thinking, the kind Arendt practiced and the kind she believed was essential to the health of any democratic society, does not produce stillness. It produces a particular kind of perpetual motion. The genuine thinker is always in the middle of something, always in the process of reconsidering, always discovering that the understanding they achieved yesterday has revealed a new layer of questions that yesterday's understanding was not equipped to handle. Consider what this means for the person who has genuinely begun to think in this way. They cannot, in any simple sense, simply participate. They cannot watch the news the way others watch it, as a report on what is happening, because they are simultaneously watching the way the news frames what is happening and asking what that framing excludes. They cannot attend a social gathering with the same ease as someone who has not begun to notice the invisible rules that govern social gatherings, the unspoken hierarchies, the consensual fictions that everyone maintains in order for the gathering to function smoothly. They cannot accept an explanation at face value, not because they are cynical or suspicious by temperament, but because their thinking has developed the habit of asking what assumptions underlie the explanation and what those assumptions reveal about the worldview of the person offering it. This is exhausting. It is genuinely physiologically exhausting, and it is also, in a social sense, isolating. Because the person who thinks freely is, in a very real way, not playing the same game as everyone else. They have seen too much of the machinery behind the performance. They know where the seams are in the consensus reality that most social interaction depends upon, and they cannot unknow this. Arendt understood this isolation intimately. She was a person who had been expelled from one country, who had lost her citizenship, who had watched the civilization she was raised within collapse into barbarism, and who had spent the rest of her life trying to understand how that collapse was possible. Her philosophical work was not abstract. It was born from the lived experience of what happens when thinking fails on a civilizational scale, when populations choose the comfort of unexamined belief over the discomfort of genuine questioning. And what she understood, what her life and work together demonstrate with extraordinary clarity, is that the person who thinks freely is not simply someone who has more information or better arguments than others. They are someone who has accepted a particular kind of permanent vulnerability. Because genuine thinking means being willing to be wrong, not just about minor things, about the kind of easily correctable errors that can be fixed with a simple update to the information you hold. But wrong in the deep sense, Wrong about the framework you have been using to understand everything. Wrong about the assumptions so fundamental that you have never had occasion to name them because they have simply been the air you breathed. To think freely is to remain genuinely open to this kind of profound revision. And to remain open to this is to accept that you will never have the solid ground beneath your feet that people who have stopped questioning get to stand on. Here is what makes this so paradoxical and so worth examining carefully. We admire in the abstract the person who thinks freely. We celebrate intellectual courage as a virtue. We hold up the figures in history who questioned consensus reality and were later proven right, the scientists who challenged orthodox understanding, the philosophers who dared uncomfortable conclusions, the artists who saw what others had not yet learned to see. We tell their stories as inspiration, and yet in practice, in daily life, in the texture of how we actually relate to people who think in this uncompromising way, we find them difficult, we find them exhausting, we find them destabilizing. We find that something in us wants them to be a little less thorough, a little more willing to accept a comfortable imprecision, a little more able to let certain things go unexamined, because the examination disrupts something we need in order to function. The free mind is dangerous to the tyrant because it refuses to accept the tyrant's version of reality as the only possible version. But the free mind is dangerous to the comfortable person for exactly the same reason. The person who thinks freely, who follows their questioning wherever it leads, who cannot simply stop at the point where further thinking would disturb the arrangement everyone has agreed upon, this person is, functionally, a constant reminder that the arrangement is arbitrary, that it was chosen, at some point, from among other possible arrangements, that it continues only because enough people continue to choose it, often without realizing they are choosing it. This is deeply threatening to anyone who has built their sense of security on the belief that things are the way they are, because they have to be. That the current structure of meaning is not a human construction, but something more fundamental, more inevitable, more natural. The thinking person, simply by thinking, reveals that this is not the case. They reveal it not by arguing, often not even by speaking, but simply by the quality of their attention, their refusal to agree automatically, their habit of pausing where others move directly forward. Arendt described the space of appearance as the place where human beings come into being for each other, where we show ourselves through our actions and our speech and become real to others and to ourselves. What she understood was that this space is always constructed, always maintained through the ongoing participation of those within it. It is not a given, it is an achievement, constantly renewed. And the person who thinks freely, who has developed the habit of stepping back from immediate participation to examine what they are participating in and why, is someone who has, in a sense, created a kind of inner space that is separate from the shared space of appearance. Not because they have withdrawn from the world, not because they are antisocial or misanthropic, but because the act of genuine thinking requires a withdrawal. It requires a turning inward, a consultation with the self about what the self actually believes as distinct from what the self is expected to believe. This inner consultation, this dialogue of the self with itself, is what Arendt identified as the essential foundation of moral life. The person who cannot be alone with their own thinking, who cannot step back from the immediate situation and ask what they genuinely think about it, is the person most vulnerable to what she famously called the banality of evil, the participation in harm, not through malice but through the simple failure to think, the bureaucrat who processes orders, the functionary who follows procedure. The person who understands themselves as simply doing their job, playing their role, acting according to the expectations of the system they are embedded in. The terrifying discovery of Arendt's analysis of the Eichmann trial was not that the man responsible for coordinating the deportation of millions of people was a monster. It was that he was ordinary, that his primary failing was not wickedness, but thoughtlessness, that he had simply never developed the habit of stepping back from what he was doing to ask what it actually meant, what it revealed about who he was choosing to be. If what I am exploring here connects with questions you have been sitting with for a long time, I want to invite you into this ongoing conversation. I create these videos for people who are not looking for easy answers, who have tried the surface-level explanations and found them insufficient, who want to understand rather than simply feel reassured. There are many of us exploring these questions together, and I would be honored to have you as part of this community. If that feels right, subscribe. Not because you need more content in your life, but because some journeys are better taken with companions who are asking the same kinds of questions you are. And whatever resonated for you in what I have shared so far, please leave it in the comments. Your reflections genuinely matter, and they often illuminate things that I have not yet found the words for. But here is the full weight of what this reveals about the free mind. The person who has genuinely developed this capacity, who has made it a habit to step back and examine, rather than simply to act and participate, who has cultivated the internal space where genuine thinking can occur, this person has accepted something very costly in exchange. They have accepted that they will experience a permanent tension between their inner understanding and their outer participation. They will know things about the situations they are in that they cannot always speak, because speaking them would require a disruption that the situation cannot accommodate. They will notice dynamics that others are invested in not noticing. They will see through performances that others need to believe are real, and they will carry this seeing as a kind of weight, because knowledge without the ability to act on it or share it does not feel like power. It feels like a particular kind of loneliness. Arendt herself lived with this. Her work was controversial not simply because her ideas were challenging, though they were. It was controversial because she could not stop thinking when thinking became uncomfortable for the people around her. Her analysis of Eichmann offended survivors of the Holocaust, not because she was wrong, but because her way of understanding what had happened was more disturbing than the simpler explanation. She refused the comfort of the monster narrative, because the monster narrative, while emotionally satisfying, did not explain what actually needed to be explained. She followed her thinking to where the thinking led, even when the destination was unpopular, even when it cost her friendships and her reputation in certain circles. She accepted the price of the free mind because she understood that the alternative was a kind of betrayal of the one faculty that makes genuine human life possible. And this is the paradox at the center of everything we have been exploring. The free mind is dangerous. To tyrants, yes, but more immediately to the person who possesses it. It destabilizes, it isolates, it makes participation more complicated, comfort more elusive, certainty more impossible. The person who genuinely thinks freely will never have the relief of simply accepting what they are told. They will never be fully at ease in the consensus reality because they can always see the seams. They will never stop questioning, not because they are incapable of rest, but because the questioning is not a phase they are going through. It is who they have become. And yet, and this is what I want to leave you with, this is precisely why it matters. Not despite the danger, but because of it. Natality, Arendt's concept of the human capacity for new beginnings, is only possible through genuine thinking. The person who has never examined their assumptions cannot truly begin anything new. They can only repeat with minor variations what has already been established. The new thing in human affairs, the genuinely unprecedented action or understanding or creation, always comes from someone who has been willing to step outside the inherited categories and ask what they are actually looking at. The free mind is dangerous because it has not been domesticated, because it has not agreed to treat the current structure of understanding as final, because it remains in the deepest sense open. And openness of this kind, genuine openness, not the performed openness of someone who talks about growth while carefully protecting every assumption they arrived with, but the real thing, the kind that will follow questioning even when it leads somewhere frightening. This is the source of everything that has ever genuinely moved human understanding forward. The tyrant fears it for a reason, because the tyrant understands, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that a single person who genuinely thinks is more destabilizing than an army that simply obeys. Armies can be countered with armies. Arguments can be countered with counter-arguments. But the person who has developed the capacity to think freely, to question the premises rather than simply the conclusions, to see the frame rather than simply the picture within it, this person changes the conversation at its most fundamental level. They make it impossible to pretend that the current arrangement is the only possible arrangement. They insist, simply by thinking, that there were choices made here and that choices can be made differently. This is not comfortable. I will not pretend it is. The free mind is not a gift in the sense of something that makes life easier. It is a gift in the more demanding sense, the sense in which any capacity that enlarges what you are capable of also enlarges what you are responsible for. The person who sees more clearly bears more. They bear the weight of what they see. They bear the difficulty of navigating a world that is often organized around assumptions they can no longer make. They bear the loneliness of an understanding that others may not be willing to share, not because others are incapable, but because the cost of admission is a willingness to remain permanently unsettled, and not everyone is willing to pay that price. But here is what I want you to sit with as we close. If you are someone who has already paid that price, or who is in the process of paying it, perhaps without fully understanding why the cost keeps coming due, then what you are experiencing is not a malfunction. It is not evidence that something has gone wrong with you, that you have developed some pathology of overthinking or excessive sensitivity. It is evidence that you have, perhaps without fully choosing it, developed the most fundamental human capacity there is, the capacity to refuse. To refuse to stop thinking at the point where thinking becomes uncomfortable, to refuse to accept the current arrangement as the only possible arrangement, to refuse, in the deepest sense, to betray the two in one, the dialogue with yourself that is the foundation of genuine selfhood. Arendt wrote that the thinking ego, the self that is engaged in genuine reflection, is always stateless and homeless, because thinking takes you outside of every particular home, every fixed position, every settled identity. It is, in her formulation, one of the most solitary activities human beings can engage in, even though its results, when they find their way into words and actions, and the shared world belong to everyone. The solitary thinking self and the shared world that thinking serves are not in opposition. They are deeply interdependent. The world needs people who can step outside of it far enough to see it clearly. And the thinking self, the free mind in all its dangerous, destabilizing, world-altering capacity, is perhaps the only thing standing between genuine human life and the endless repetition of what has always been done because no one ever stopped to ask if there was another way. You have felt this. Perhaps you have not known what to call it. Perhaps you have sometimes wished you could stop feeling it. But I think if you are honest with yourself, you know that the alternative is not actually rest. The alternative is a kind of sleep. And whatever the costs of wakefulness, whatever the loneliness and the exhaustion and the permanent unsettledness, there is something in you that has already decided that sleep is not acceptable. That the truth, even when it is inconvenient, even when it makes everything more complicated, even when it puts you at odds with the comfortable consensus around you, is worth the difficulty of seeing it clearly. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.